and the parasite was then in the land. In other words, there were some folk who didn't belong to God, who were watching the actions of those who did belong to God. And if they had broke out and started fighting amongst themselves, it would have sent the wrong message to those who didn't know God about how folk who know God ought to act. In God's house, it ought to be in your house that we don't fight against each other, but we got to fight for each other. In Nehemiah chapter 4 and beginning at verse number 7, in Nehemiah chapter 4 and beginning at verse number 7, when Nehemiah was rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, and when they had began to encounter some difficulty, when the folk in the land had decided that they were going to come against the children of God and stop their rebuilding process, Nehemiah had a strategy that he put in order so that the children of God could maintain family peace and still work on the wall they were trying to build. In Nehemiah chapter 4 and beginning at verse number 7, the Bible said, when it came to pass that when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabian and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the wall of Jerusalem were made up and that the breaches began to be stopped, then they were very wroth and conspired all of them together to come and fight against Jerusalem to hinder it. And see, this is what you need to understand as you seek to build up your house, that in your house starts to come together, that the enemy is watching your house come together, and the enemy will consciously decide to come together themselves to stop what you're trying to put together. When you start to try to get your house together, when you start to make God's rules your rules in the house, when both you and your spouse have decided that if God is going to bless this house, then we got to make a conscious decision to serve God in this house. When the enemy sees that he's going to come from the outside and try to get off into the inside so he can tear up what you're trying to build up. And so when Nehemiah had heard that their adversaries were going to come and to fight against them to hinder what they're trying to do, the Bible said, nevertheless, we made our prayer unto God and then set a watch against them day and night because of them. This goes back to the principle that Jesus taught his disciples while he was in the Garden of Gethsemane. He told them to watch and pray that you enter not into temptation. He said your spirit may be willing, but your flesh is going to be weak. And so you can't just watch and you can't just pray, but you got to watch and pray so that the adversary don't get a foothold in your house. When it looks like things are going bad in your house, it's time to watch and pray. When it seems like the love we used to have is not the love we got right now, it's time to watch and pray. When it looks like our children are starting to get beside themselves and travel a direction that we don't want them to go, it's time to watch and pray. And then after you watch and then after you pray, it's time to put on some armor. It's time to put on some battle gear, because there's some enemies you can pray for, but then there are some enemies you're going to have to fight against. When you look at verses 13 and 14 of this text, Nehemiah said that I set in the lower places behind the wall and on the places, and I even sent people after their families with swords, spears, and bows. And I looked and rose up and said unto the nobles and unto the rulers and the rest of the people that you ought not be afraid of them, but remember the Lord, which is great and terrible, and fight for your brethren. Nehemiah says it is a responsibility of those who are trying to keep the house to fight for the house. Nehemiah said, put your spear right by your side, get you a bow and arrow and strap it to your back. I need you to get your weapons of war, get you a spear and put it in your hand, because it's time for us to go to battle against the enemy. We as children of God are not fighting against flesh and blood, but we are fighting against principalities, we are fighting against powers, we are fighting against the rulers of darkness, we are fighting against spiritual wickedness, we are fighting against the influence of the devil, we are fighting against something that we cannot see, we are fighting against something that we can't get our hands on. And so we need to arm ourselves, and we need to put on the whole arm of God, that we can march together, we can march in sync, one by one together, and you get your house together, and you let your house be established upon the principles, upon the laws, and let God lay the foundation in your house, so that if anybody comes against your house, you're all ready to fight for your house. You ought to not fight inside the house, but you ought to fight for the house, because there are some things in life that are just worth fighting for, to set the tone, and the future of my children is worth fighting for, just to make sure that they can grow up with a secure relationship with God, is worth fighting for, to let them know that in all things God must come first, is worth fighting for, having the right to bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord is worth fighting for, just to be happy in my marriage is worth fighting for, to be able to be crazy in love with my spouse is worth fighting for, just to have the ability to wake up and decide to have a good day today, to say that this is the day that the Lord has made, and I will rejoice and be glad in it, is worth fighting for, just to be able to sleep at night without wetting my pillow with tears is worth fighting for, just to be able to regain my self-worth and understand that I'm more than the mistakes I made in the past is worth fighting for, just to be able to hold my head up high and understand that my worth is not determined by what somebody did to me, but my worth is determined about what God did for me, is worth fighting for, just to be able to rebuild my faith and get the fight back I used to have. It's just worth fighting for. Oh, just to be able to crave the fellowship of the saints, to be able to hunger and thirst after righteousness, just to be able to come into God's house and to sing God's praise and to pray my prayer unto God, just to be able to wrap my arms around somebody who's going through something and tell them that you're not by yourself, but that we're in this together, is worth fighting for, just to have my relationship with God secured, just to be able to walk with Him and to talk with Him and to let Him tell me that I am His own, is worth fighting for.